Mother Spirit, Father Spirit, where are you? In the sky song, in the forest, sounds your cry? What to give you? What to call you? What am I? Who we are and what we call God are very much linked. And there are innumerable metaphors for God. By many accounts, God is not only indescribable, but well beyond our comprehension. Humans can't even agree on one name for God or whether that ineffable entity even exists. So, coming up with a singular metaphor for something beyond our comprehension, whose very existence we don't understand, is nearly impossible. So I've chosen that topic for today. I decided to return to this topic that I briefly addressed in my last sermon. I described witnessing firsthand how comforting certain belief structures were for members of my hometown and my family during times of grief and mourning, 2 family memorial services. I realized how much those rituals and metaphors are a part of a culture, mainly because I could see that they worked for them, while others now resonate for me. Deciding to investigate metaphor, I found an online article from the NIH National Library of Medicine written by Adam F. Fetterman, a psychology professor at the University of Houston. It's titled, "What Shall We Call God? An Exploration of Metaphors Coded from Descriptions of God from a Large U.S. Undergraduate Sample." You may have read it. In the article, he reasoned that if we know a person's conceptualization of God's character, we can predict important psychological outcomes. Not surprisingly, there are strong correlations between what people believe and what they think God believes. God created in our own image, so to speak. Of course, this isn't earth-shattering news. Well over a century ago, Susan B. Anthony said, "I distrust those people who know so well what God wants them to do because it always coincides with their own desires." Because God is beyond our understanding, any conceptualization must be metaphoric. However, as humans, we are limited in our ability to comprehend such non-natural entities and must conceptualize God within our physical boundaries. We are limited by the difficulty of thinking past our bodies and experiences, and so must liken God to things based on our physical experiences. So we have metaphor. Visualizing God based on our own experiences reminded me of the scene in the 1995 movie Jeffrey. Father Dan, played by Nathan Lane, is describing God to the title character. He says, "First, here's how you see God. He's a Columbia recording artist." Jeffrey says, "What?" Father Dan says, "You got your idea from God where most gay kids get it. The album cover of My Fair Lady. Original cast. It's got the Hirschfeld caricature of George Bernard Shaw up in the clouds manipulating Rex Harrison and Julie Andrews on strings, like marionettes. It was your parents' album, you were little, you thought it was a picture of God, as I believe did Shaw, right?" Jeffrey, surprised, says, "Yeah." As a child, my concept of God was strikingly similar. In fact, except for the fact that it was my grandparents' album, not my parents', this is precisely my story. And it was verified by images of the grandfatherly white man with a beard described in Sunday school, and a famous painting on a ceiling by Michelangelo. So perhaps even gay culture has its own metaphors and images of the Almighty. When I was in seminary, most other students were Protestant, and so by extension Trinitarian. When writing papers, I would make the case that it didn't make sense to say God was three in one when God can't really be accurately described at all, at least by humans. I said it may be a great metaphor, but it was no more than a metaphor. No less a thinker than Thomas Jefferson called it the incomprehensible jargon of the Trinitarian arithmetic, that three are one and one is three. Now, I tried to Google Trinity as metaphor this week to back up my and Thomas's assertion, and the best I could do was find people describing good and bad analogies for the Holy Trinity. Many now seem to just take it as fact. That's how God is. Of course, this is precisely where our theological ancestors ran up against the powers that be. From the Council of Nicaea to Michael Servetus being burned at the stake with a copy of his book on the errors of the Trinity chained to his leg. As I've indicated, I have gravitated to a less concrete metaphor for God. Not only do I not subscribe to a three-in-one metaphor, I'm not crazy about a few other attributes people unquestioningly believe describe God. I don't believe God is omnipotent, infinite in power, or omniscient, all-knowing. God isn't all-knowing in process theology, which our second reading gave a user-friendly introduction to, which kind of blows a hole in that whole Calvinism and predestination thing that early Unitarians railed against. Because we are free to choose, here and now, God doesn't know in advance what will happen. But, as Reverend Stephen said, in a universe of free choosers, God can't make anyone or anything do anything. But God pulls on the heartstrings and activates deeper, life-giving, and love-filled longings. God is what keeps pulling the universe forward, pulling it toward life and love and peace and connection. God hopes and lures and loves. I've come to prefer a far from concrete, benevolent partner than a concrete George Bernard Shaw doppelganger. But despite being staunchly Unitarian, I was somehow asked to read and reflect upon the document Theology and the People by Pope Francis for the Metropolitan Organization Leadership Retreat last weekend. I was struck by how some of the themes resonated with those of my last sermon. In one passage it read, "And one cannot understand people without taking into account their culture. And for a church to speak to and respond to a people, it must be in the midst of those people and their culture, discerning its liberating action from those people and their interests." Now, the Pope's incentive to describe the importance of understanding others' cultures stemmed from his desire for others to connect to the poor, their popular culture, and their ethos. He wrote, "Understanding the poor as the people means discovering and recognizing that they are bearers of a cultural ethos of their own, whose religious soul or heart always wagers on hope. He lifts up what he sees as the values of the poor, a spontaneous attention to the other, and ability to devote time to others and go to another's aid without calculating time or sacrifice," which strikes me as very different from prosperity gospel. At the leadership retreat, I reiterated the importance of listening to and gaining the input and helping to empower those one is trying to help. In one seminary class, we were given a hypothetical scenario where we were given a problem and asked to describe how we would guide our congregations to address it. Our group scenario involved a poor community who found the city was going to build a trash incinerator right next to them, because, of course, the wealthier folks made sure it wasn't being built in their neighborhoods. We came up with lots of good ideas about how to address the issue. The one other UU in our group was insistent we talk to the people in the neighborhood, find out how they would like to fight it, and help empower them to do so. Our group, like many well-meaning people, had fallen into that trap of thinking we knew best what would work for others without asking them. Now, I'm sure I took the idea of accepting different cultures further than the Pope intended. I imagine he envisioned learning about the cultural ethos of others as learning how their culture uniquely practices Christianity and supporting them in that, while I'm less likely to put such parameters on how others approach finding meaning or how they ask the deep questions of life. I've talked many times about Bishop Carlton Pearson in my sermons because his metaphor for God changed radically. His life changed radically. A wildly popular evangelical pastor, he realized the judgmental God, laser-focused on sin and salvation, didn't work for him anymore. He believed in a loving God and that all humans are already saved. He found himself accused of heresy and lost his ministry. Now, were Bishop Pearson in a bizarro world where everything is opposite, it might be the story of Russell Moore. He was a devout Baptist, ostracized for attempting to hold his church to their professed beliefs. As you can imagine, it has changed his life as well. You may have heard the interview on NPR in August with Moore, the editor-in-chief of Christianity Today magazine. He was talking about his book, Losing Our Religion, an altar call for evangelical America. He was a top official in the Southern Baptist Convention until publicly criticizing Donald Trump, the convention's response to a sexual abuse crisis, and to what he viewed as an increased tolerance for white nationalism within the church. He resigned and found himself outside the denomination that had essentially defined his life. Moore described why he thinks Christianity is in crisis. Well, it was the result of having multiple pastors tell me essentially the same story about quoting the Sermon on the Mount parenthetically in their preaching, turn the other cheek, to have someone come up after and say, "Where did you get those liberal talking points?" And what was alarming to me is that in most of these scenarios, when the pastor would say, "I'm literally quoting Jesus Christ," the response would not be, "I apologize." The response would be, "Yes, but that doesn't work anymore. That's weak." Moore continued, "And when we get to the point where the teachings of Jesus himself are seen as subversive to Christians, then we're in a crisis. Because how one's culture views their metaphors for God guides their perceptions. It guides their actions. And how we come to understand the world can lead us to modify our metaphor to fit. Are we looking for meaning in places that will grow our spiritual lives and our compassion for others? Just this morning, literally, on social media, I saw this quote by Joseph Campbell. "If you want to change the world, you have to change the metaphor." Now, back to Professor Fetterman's online article. Because the study respondents consisted almost entirely of Christian participants in the U.S., it is difficult to make broad conclusions or to generalize to universal God concepts. Also, it may explain the high number of concrete anthropomorphic metaphors, as opposed to the less concrete images used in Eastern religions. Of course, UUs are also likely to use less concrete metaphors, like, for instance, the scent of pancakes in the morning, an image that I love. William Ellery Channing said, "God is another name for human intelligence, raised above all error and imperfection and extended to all possible truth." I'm still trying to figure out what to do with that. The thing that struck me most about the article were the results of a study that looked at those who use more concrete metaphors, such as envisioning God as a kindly old man, as opposed to those who use more abstract concepts like God is love. It's true, Fetterman points out, that God is love is the mapping of an abstract concept, God, with another relatively abstract concept, love. But because love, and for that matter the smell of pancakes, are relatively more concrete than God, most people have firsthand experience with love and pancakes that they can use to ground a God concept. But because the purpose of metaphors is to provide meaning to relatively abstract concepts by making them more concrete, less concrete metaphors seem to provide less meaning to abstract concepts. So the more concrete the metaphor, the more meaning might be derived from it. So, when people try to find the meaning of God or meaning of life through God, if they use a less concrete metaphor, they will derive less meaning from that metaphor. But those who need less meaning from a God metaphor may very well find meaning from other things, like relationships or family. When I witnessed my family seemingly finding more meaning in the rituals uplifting their metaphors of God in heaven, it was apparently because their metaphors are more concrete than mine. A kindly, human-looking God, with my mom at one side and my brother on the other, is far more comforting as my father breathed his last than the metaphor of the scent of pancakes in the morning. There is much to consider when exploring metaphor. Being non-creedal, we aren't concerned with how or if you find meaning through a metaphor for God, or choose to look elsewhere, unless you'd like us to join you as you search to find what works for you. Because finding meaning, exploring that spiritual aspect of ourselves, is the heartbeat of what we do here. I really think it boils down to these two sentences from Karen Armstrong's The Spiral Staircase, My Climb Out of Darkness. If your understanding of the divine made you kinder, more empathetic, and impelled you to express sympathy in concrete acts of loving kindness, this was good theology. But if your notion of God made you unkind, belligerent, cruel, or self-righteous, or if it led you to kill in God's name, it was bad theology. Amen, and so be it.